Alright, we're back. I kicked the cat out. See, door closed. It's not gonna last. Alright, so that was contracts in a very small nutshell, so let's move on to contract management. This section has words of wisdom from my days as a contract administrator, but also Cooper Chapter 6 does a great job of outlining current trends in contract management. Many of these slides are straight from a training module I created for city employees that are responsible for contract oversight. So basically, this is real stuff that I teach to real contract administrators at the city. A note about vocabulary here: the person who manages the contract for the department or departments that will use the vendor is called the contract administrator or the contract manager or the project manager, but contract administrator is probably the most common, so I'm going to use that for the rest of the lecture just for consistency, but they all mean the same thing. Alright, so contract administrators should establish regular communication with the vendor, even when there are no pressing issues. They should also set and maintain customer service expectations, often laid out in the contract, either in progress reports or invoicing sections. It is helpful to continually refer back to the contract document so that the goods or services continue to be delivered according to the scope and other stipulations. Contract managers or contract administrators shouldn't just communicate when the vendor is performing badly. They should establish regular contact and provide positive feedback as well. Remember, the vendor is a partner in the provision of the service, and that at the end of the day, you really need each other. Alright, so remember this from last week. We talked about direct monitoring, follow-up monitoring, monitoring by exception. Contract administrators should set and maintain the service level expectations, and it is helpful to continually refer back to the contract to make sure that they're sticking to those performance measurements. And we talked about the different monitoring methods, the direct monitoring, follow-up monitoring, and which ones are, more and less expensive and easy to do. So, regardless of how you track the method of track the performance, you must use the contract as a guide. Remember how we discussed at length that if a task or responsibility isn't in the scope of work, you can't require the contractor to perform it? This is where that comes into play. You must hold the vendor to what requirements are in the contract. But sometimes you just can't foresee everything that may need to be done or that can go wrong. And if that's the case and a situation arises that isn't covered by the contract term, the contract administrator must work with the departmental leadership, at the municipality and the service provider to come up with a solution on the way forward. Oh, that was up. I need to go down. There we go. So here is an example of how the emergency road call service contract administrator could track the activity of the vendor every day. Activity tracking is crucial to invoice reconciliation at the end of the billing period, so it's really important to keep this type of spreadsheet going at all times. The columns represent the date the service was performed and which piece of equipment, in this case trucks belonging to the different departments, needed the service of the contractor, and the time the call was placed, the time the call was responded to, and the trip and service fees anticipated from the vendor from the pricing worksheet, and any notes. So you can see that this is just one way you could kind of set up to kind of figure out, okay, how much are we expecting to pay, and then you can compare this to the invoices once they come in at the end of the month. So if your contract includes liquidated damages for services not performed or per performance, it is absolutely crucial that you keep a record of instances where the vendor didn't live up to the contract. You have to keep a record and communicate in writing with the vendor when these situations arise. This is important because if you don't keep a record and communicate what's gone wrong, you cannot collect liquidated damages later. It's very easy to let the vendor slip here and there, and if they do something really bad in the future, all you have is anecdotal evidence that they haven't been performing well. It's so common in my line of work for a customer to come to me and say, the vendors performed poorly, we really just don't like them, but have zero evidence and zero written communications telling the vendor this, so you really can't hold a vendor responsible if they haven't been told. This is an example of how the emergency road call contract administrator could track when the vendor has not performed to the standards set forth in the contract. These instances should be discussed with the vendor in case there were extenuating circumstances, and you can see here that the notes column indicates the circumstances and whether a charge should or should not be incurred. Any charges incurred can be credited to the next month's invoice, or in other ways as approved by the department director, like a check. So one last note on managing a contract. Managing a contract takes time. You can't just put a contract in place and expect the vendor to keep performing at a high level with no oversight from the local government. Not closely following the activities of a vendor can lead to low performance, service interruptions, and citizen anger if the services aren't performed. You also can't assume you can settle all disputes with the vendor yourself. Reach out to your department leadership or an attorney for the city or county or municipality if you need to. So now let's discuss what happens when the initial term of your contract is up. Remember I mentioned that we often have an initial term, then an optional renewal years after that. Now we're at the point where the first term is up and the municipality has to decide whether to continue with the vendor or resolicit the service by posting a new RFP. And since I know it's hard to visualize what I mean by renewals, termination, and resolicitation timing, here's a quick graphic to illustrate. And kind of think of each of the small bubbles as being a year and the big bubbles as being a decision point. So our example contract has a 3-year initial term and 2 1-year renewal terms. At the end of the initial term, which would be here, the department or departments that use the contract need to reassess whether the vendor is performing at a high enough level to renew for the first 1-year renewal term. This is when you would think about whether their performance has been satisfactory, whether there are other companies in the marketplace that provide a better service, or whether you even need the service anymore at all. If a vendor has been doing really well and there are no obvious alternatives out there, we almost always renew their contract. If they've been doing a mediocre job but haven't caused any major problems or damage, then we would weigh the time and cost of resoliciting, kind of in these 2 periods, against continuing with okay service. If they've been doing very poorly, that's when you want to do everything in your power to resolicit at this point, after the first or second year, after the third or the first renewal year. So if you decide to terminate a contract, whether it be at the end of the initial term or at the end of the full term, you have to be careful how you manage the end of the relationship. Usually we start with the resolicitation process for a service well in advance of a contract terminating because, as we've discussed before, it takes several months to properly solicit for a service. In that time, the current vendor will learn whether or not they'll continue to serve the municipality, and if they are not, some vendors will lash out. This could look like deliberate sabotage of equipment, office space, or documents, a decrease in performance equality, or embezzlement of funds should they have access to city information or data. That all being said, usually vendors want to be in good standing so they can win the municipality's business back if at all possible. Even if they aren't the chosen vendor in the resolicitation process, they still want the municipality to provide a positive reference to other potential customers. Most are realistic about the business world and that you win some and you lose them. So regardless of whether you decide to renew or terminate, it helps to plan ahead. Make sure that you have the contract term clearly stated in the contract and how renewal will take place. Termination is even more important to include in detail clearly in a contract document because a lot can go wrong if a vendor does not get their contract renewed, which we'll talk about in a minute. Regardless, make sure to keep a record of why you're renewing or terminating and be very transparent about your decision. If you do decide not to renew a contract, you must leave yourself plenty of time to resolicit, as we mentioned. If the government does decide to perform the services in-house, this can be a very difficult transition, especially if they've never done it before. Going back to our residential recycling example, think about the capital assets, employees, and other needs of performing recycling services every single day, every week, every year. You need trucks, people, routes, and an education campaign to notify residents of the service change. That can take a lot of planning and should be entered into with a lot of gravitas. That being said, there are a lot of advantages to internal service provision. Often internal services can save money because you're not paying private sector companies to pay their employees private sector wages. You're also not having to oversee a contractor, you're just overseeing your internal employees. It can also enhance the local government's image by directly providing jobs to citizens in the community instead of ones in other cities, states, or even countries. For example, if we had been outsourcing our IT support to a company based in California for basic things like Microsoft Office issues, but then decided to hire our own internal IT Microsoft Office specialist, we've now hired one or more individuals in the area that needed a job. So our last special procurement type is construction. As next week, I'll be telling you more about specific procurement programs involving minority-owned, women-owned, and small business enterprises. This week's interview is with Janella Walker, who is the Assistant Contract Manager in the City of Charlotte's Engineering and Property Management Department. As always, feel free to stop here and read her interview before we go on. So construction refers to the building of new and the maintenance of existing municipal facilities. You may not think of that as something the government does, but consider this. The city of Charlotte alone has over 160 facilities. We build and maintain everything from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Government Center uptown, where about 2,000 city and county employees work, to tiny pump houses where one employee may visit each week. That's a lot of square footage, lawns, bushes, driveways, parking decks, and HVAC systems to build and keep in shape. Building new facilities all by itself would keep an entire department busy. Municipalities plan years and years in advance what buildings they are going to need down the line. This involves capital investment, budget planning, regional planning to determine where the next fire station or police patrol division needs to be based on population growth, and keeping up to date on building standards like LEED and Green Globe certifications. Basically, this is really a diverse procurement field that requires a lot of planning and forethought. Construction is interesting because it's both the most complicated but also the most structured type of public procurement, and every jurisdiction does it regardless of how big they are. Since every jurisdiction will enter into construction contract at some point, there are lots of state statutes that govern how these contracts are solicited. One thing Janella mentions in her interview that I really like is the need to keep up with changing technologies and trends. I think that's true for most procurement types in that you need to keep up with what's going on, but she's the first practitioner to really mention it, and I bet the reason is the procurement officer for a construction contract has to have an extensive knowledge of buildings and building requirements in addition to procurement knowledge, so you have to have both of those skill sets in order to do construction procurement. So what makes construction contracting challenging is also what makes it easier. There are lots of state statutes regarding construction, but that means that the rules are already laid out for local governments and very little interpretation is needed. With service contracting, there are a lot of it depends, or sometimes this is what you do, depending on circumstances, but with construction contracting, soliciting is very cut and dry. You basically write your specifications, you post those specifications, whichever vendor has the lowest cost wins, and they build the building for you. There's a lot to manage on the back end, but that's not usually the procurement officer's problem, if you will. So we will discuss minority, small, and women-owned businesses next week, but many jurisdictions use those specific procurement programs to get use construction procurement to get the majority of their participation from small, minority, and women-owned businesses, because so many businesses are involved in building, from general contractors to roofers to carpet installers. There's a lot of opportunities there for small businesses. Another thing that I really like that Janella mentions is that construction contracting is very visible. You can drive down the street in any town and see a building that a local government construction contract officer made happen, which is pretty cool. So that's the end of this lecture. Only one more to go next week. Don't forget to complete your discussion topics for the week, and I will see you for our last week of lecture next week in week 10.